All right, so let's jump into these readings. Our first reading was written by Dr. Troy Johnson and Dr. Joanne Nigel. Dr. Johnson is a combat decorated veteran, or was a combat decorated veteran. He passed away in 2013. He had his MA in American Indian History and Federal Indian Law from UCLA, his PhD in history from UCLA. He was a professor of American Indian Studies at CSU Long Beach. He was the director of American Indian Studies program and the chair of anthropology. Dr. Nigel has her PhD in sociology from Stanford, is the University of Kansas distinguished professor. Her work focuses on ethnicity, gender, sexuality in the US and the global system, American Indian activism, the militarization of science, and global climate change. They wrote a piece called Remembering Alcatraz 25 years after, and it is a reflection on the activist work or the activism in the occupation of Alcatraz. And so there's a couple of things I want to go over with you. Most of this comes directly from the reading Indians of All Tribes. Is a protest group of about 80 Native groups. The Treaty of Fort Laramie stated that abandoned or disused federal lands are to be returned to the natives who once occupied it instead of it just standing disused. Alcatraz had stood disused for some period of time. In 1868, the Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed. A conference was held in what is present-day Wyoming, ending in a treaty with the Sioux people to end the U.S. Indian Wars, and in reality, also to push Native groups further west to the Black Hills onto reservations to accommodate U.S. expansion. I want to give you some history about Alcatraz. Alcatraz is an island. It is also a fort that was built in 1849 to guard San Francisco. As early as 1859, it became used as a military prison. In August of 1934, it was designated as a maximum security penitentiary, which I think is the history that most of us know. That was closed in 63, so it only lasted for about 30 years. And then in 1968, the Indians of all tribes occupied it for 19 months. So bear in mind that Alcatraz has had several uses and several iterations. One of the reasons why it began to be disused as a prison was because of the dilapidated conditions of the building. The 1972 takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA. So in protest of the many treaties that were not honored by the government, protesters took over the BIA for 6 days, beginning on November 3rd of 1972 in DC. Nearly 300 North American tribes participated in this particular form of protest. Oftentimes, when the US government would go into an agreement or sign a treaty with Native American nations, oftentimes they would dishonor the treaty or not honor the treaty, go back on the treaty, depending on the needs of the government or the needs of what the government considers its citizens. So many of the treaties, again, if you take a look at some of those treaties, many of those treaties, what was agreed to was then dishonored or they reneged on the agreement. The US government reneged on the agreement. A lot of you have heard about Wounded Knee. 1973, Wounded Knee was a protest. It was a 71-day occupation of a town of Wounded Knee in South Dakota that began on February 27th of 1973. 200 Lakota and American Indian Movement activists, AIM, seized the town. They chose that particular site because it had been the site of the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, where 300 Lakota people were murdered by the US government. So the occupation was significant in that they chose that site to pay homage to the lives that were lost. Joseph Stuntz was mentioned in this reading. He was a 23-year-old Native American man who was killed on a reservation in South Dakota by FBI agents. The White Roots of Peace is an Iroquois organization founded in 1969. The Longest Walk began Alcatraz on February 11th, 1978 to Washington, D.C. It took 5 months to protest the treatment, and it was to protest the mistreatment of indigenous populations. The key concepts, again, some of these are, all of these are absolutely directly from the book. There's nothing here that you have to guess at, and on the quiz, it will come directly from the reading. Number 8, I do want to go over number 8, list some of the significant events and social movements of 1960s and early 1970s, which we talked about a little bit when I first introduced you to ethnic studies. But the Vietnam War, which was also considered an unjust war, the civil rights movement was happening. The Black Power movement is happening in the late 60s to early 70s. The rise of La Raza is happening. The Latino movement is happening. Second wave feminism is occurring at this particular time. There's a rise of the New Left. There is the Third World strikes that are occurring, which the Third World strikes, you know, are the strikes to get ethnic studies and focus studies in colleges and universities. All of these are playing in context with the occupation of Alcatraz, or the movement of Native people to gain representation and justice. What were the roots of American Indian activism? Centuries of mistreatment of indigenous people were the roots. What was the failure of the government relocation program? I want to go over that one with you as well. The federal government relocation programs of the 1950s and 1960s, which promised to move reservation residents to major urban areas for vocational training and to assist them in finding jobs, adequate housing, and financial assistance while training was underway, failed because what was supposed to be a 3 months training was only a 3-week training instead of job assistance, where it ensured that the people who were trained was hired. They were only given one referral. Housing was actually skid row, so they didn't have any real housing accommodations for them, and there was inadequate family support, or financial support, excuse me, in San Francisco. So these federal government relocation programs were happening in several different locations. In San Francisco, particularly, people waited at the bus station for representatives to show up for days without anyone who actually showed up. So the federal government didn't have a real investment in securing the assimilation and progress of indigenous people into what's, U.S. society. They created these programs, but didn't actually adhere to them or make sure that they took care of the indigenous people that they were, in essence, displacing, that they had already displaced once, and then they turn around and tell them there's this program, come here, leave your home and come here, and then they're displacing them a second time because they're not giving them adequate housing, adequate food, adequate financial support, and they're not providing the kind of training or job placement that they had actually said that they were going to provide. 3 reasons Native populations relocated to the Bay Area: federal relocation programs, which we've already discussed were a failure. They wanted to maintain the lifestyle that they gained from joining the military, so and receiving a regular paycheck. Many indigenous people joined the military and fought in the different wars, that one being the Vietnam War, and I believe actually the Korean War. And so as a person in the military, they're receiving regular paychecks. And so they moved to the Bay Area in order to try to find or sustain the financial lifestyle, find a job that would allow them to work and receive regular paychecks. And they wanted to work in the defense industry, which is beginning to thrive on the West Coast. I want you to understand that there are actually 3 occupations of Alcatraz Island by Native people. The first one happens on March 9th, 1964. It's only a 4-hour-long occupation by 5 Sioux Indians. Beva Coultier and her cousin heard of a provision in the 1868 Sioux Treaty, which is also the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, with the federal government, that stated that all abandoned federal lands reverted to the ownership of the Sioux people. So the idea was that once the federal government had confiscated the lands and displaced Native peoples, that once the federal government abandoned that land reverted back to the ownership of the Sioux people. During occupation, they issued press releases in accordance with the 1868 treaty and demanded better treatment for urban Indians. Richard McKenzie pressed the claim for title through the courts, which denied them. They said that provision actually didn't exist in the treaty itself. The third occupation was the Bay Area College and University students of 1869. Richard Oakes, who you saw in that little short film, one of the San Francisco State University's Third World Liberation Front student protesters. So he was a part of the protesters who got ethnic studies instituted or established at SFSU. Oakes and other SFSU Native students began discussing the possibility of occupying Alcatraz Island during the summer of 1970 as a symbolic protest, a call for Native people or Indian people self-determination. However, plans were pushed forward because of the destruction of the San Francisco Indian Center by fire in late October of 1969. So on November 9th, 1969, as a symbolic gesture, they circled the island in a boat and declared it Indian property. During that circling of the boat, Oakes and 4 other protesters or activists swam ashore and claimed Alcatraz in the name of all Indians of all tribes, but they left the island after meeting the caretaker, who asked them to leave. A few days later, on November 20th, 1969, Richard Oakes, Ray Spang, and Edward Costello recruited Indian students from UCLA, and 80 or so indigenous people occupy Alcatraz. 70 were Indian students from UCLA. It lasted 19 months and brought together Indian people from across the US, Alaska, Canada, Mexico, and South America. They had plans for Alcatraz. This was not just a fly-by-night kind of occupation. They created an elected council. They assigned everyone jobs, security, sanitation, housing, cooking, childcare, laundry. They met several times a day so that they were always in dialogue and in discussion with one another, creating a unanimous rule democracy so that there had to be full and total agreement. While they're on the island, they demanded the deed for the island. They wanted to establish an Indian university, a cultural center, a museum, and federal funding to establish those things. A couple of things contributed to the breakdown of leadership at Alcatraz and eventually ended the occupation. First, Richard Oakes becomes kind of the spokesperson and the figurehead. You see him on the video footage. He's the one who makes the statement of selling or giving the government $24 in glass beads and red cloth. And I'll tell you a little bit about why he said that in just a moment. But many people didn't know him and didn't agree with him as a leader. They wanted a egalitarian society. So that's one of the things was Oates's leadership comes under fire in question. Many of the students had to return back to school in January of 1970. So that was another cause for the breakdown. New arrivals of the reservation harken back to the rhetoric of the 1964 occupation in the Sioux Treaty, a claim that had already been denied in the courts. Some non-Indians brought hippie and drug culture with them. Of course, this is the, free love, free spirit kind of period of time. And when people heard about the occupation, a lot of non-Indians came with their own agendas of, kind of living free. So they brought drug culture and hippie culture with them, taking up residence on the island. And then finally, Oakes's 12-year-old daughter fell from the third floor of an unsupervised area stairwell. Remember that the facilities themselves were not in good condition. And so the occupation was both inside and outside, mostly because there was a lot of damage inside of the buildings. And so Oakes's daughter fell from the third floor of a stairwell and died. And so that kind of ended his time there. Okay, I want to talk to you a little bit about that statement that he makes, $24 in glass beads and red cloth. And I actually do mention this in an earlier video talking about Manhattan, specifically talking about Manhattan. So Manhattan, the 16 acres that is Manhattan Island, was sold or was purchased by the Dutch for $24 or so in trade goods, the trade goods being glass beads and red cloth. So I wanted you all to see this. It's actually a book that's like for K through 12. It's called Mannahatta to Manhattan. And it chronicles the history of the Lenape people and their interaction with the Dutch and their selling of the island. Yeah, it includes maps, it includes different historical facts, and I can provide a PDF link if you want to take a look at this. But this particular piece gives you the reference to the $24 in glass beads and red cloth, because it is what is thought to be the sale price or how much the Dutch were able to purchase Manhattan Island from indigenous people. Again, understanding that there's an entirely different conceptualization of land and occupation of land and ownership of land and use of nature between the Western concept of land ownership, and Western being the John Lacanian concept of land and land ownership, and the indigenous concept of land and being in community with land and nature. One of the quotes that I pulled out was, in the Bay Area, one of the largest of the more than a dozen relocation sites. So remember the federal government relocation program. There were more than a dozen relocation sites. The Bay Area is just one of them. The newly urban Indians formed their own organizations to provide the support that the government had promised but failed to provide. Generally, these groups were known by the tribes' names, such as the Sioux Club and the Navajo Club, but they were also social clubs. So they were organizing to take care of their and address and redress their needs, but they were also organizing as a social club. So I wanted you to have that information as well. That is the end of this particular reading, and I will start the video for the next reading.